There's lots of really pertinent, very recent research. The United States is particularly vulnerable to increased precipitation, intensification of precipitation, and therefore floods. The amount of water vapor content of the atmosphere is accelerating. And in the US, the rate of increase of precipitation is over 5 times the global average. So everywhere you look on the research, the United States is particularly vulnerable.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And today, I think to no one's surprise, we'll be talking about a phenomena that has been sadly in the news quite a bit lately, and that is floods, climate change driven floods that have had disastrous consequences for people in the United States and elsewhere. And what we're calling our program today is Raging Waters, Climate Change Truly Unleashed. Basically, these floods are becoming more ferocious, they're becoming more frequent as the climate warms. As the climate warms, as I'm sure Paul and Peter will talk about, the atmosphere holds more water, and that water has to go somewhere. What might be a surprising statistic, it does appear that at least in the advanced countries, countries that are wealthier, deaths from flooding have decreased in the 21st century compared to the end of the 20th century, in some cases quite substantially, presumably due to better warning systems and better planning and information available to people. That is not the case in less developed countries, and it remains to be seen whether that will be the case as floods intensify and get more severe and more, sort of without warning, as we saw tragically in Texas. So with that as a kind of introduction, as always, I'm delighted and happy to introduce our panelists today, our regulars, Dr. Peter Carter from British Columbia in Canada. Peter is a retired medical doctor. He has been an IPCC expert reviewer and is the originator and manages the Climate Emergency Institute. So, Peter, give us your perspective on this, what appears to be this almost sort of biblical eruption of floods that are occurring most everywhere.
Yeah, well, like so many things, this has been predicted over many, many years. Most of us are aware of the fundamental equation that for every degree C, the atmosphere and the lower atmosphere water vapor increases. But it's not that simple because things aren't linear with the climate change and they're regional as well. And of course, we've been reminded about this very dramatically by the floods in the US, in Texas, and in the Northeast up to New York City, right? So there's lots of really pertinent, very recent research. The United States is particularly vulnerable to increased precipitation, intensification of precipitation, and therefore floods. Next is Europe, that's particularly vulnerable. So, first of all, what's happening to water vapor then? Because, of course, that's where it all comes from, and because we have global warming, we've got more water vapor in the atmosphere. Well, research says that is increasing. It's increasing very fast. In fact, the amount of water vapor content of the atmosphere is accelerating. We know surface warming will keep accelerating. We know that because of accelerating greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and radiative heat forcing. So we had a program a while ago about atmospheric rivers. So there's some recent research that confirms atmospheric rivers are increasing. There's also research that shows that heavy rain, precipitation, frequency, and damage that is escalating. Some very interesting research using the twin grace satellites confirmed that increased global warming is increasing rainfall intensification. A rather dramatic number that actually I got from the EPA, which is recent EPA, is that apparently the population affected by floods has increased 20% in the past 15 years. So yeah, we do know that the number of deaths has declined dramatically, but the cause of all those deaths is increasing very dramatically. So I took a look at the United States of America, and from the EPA, recent EPA, the amount of land affected by heavy rain in the United States is increasing. The total annual precipitation has increased in the US and globally. And in the US, the rate of increase of precipitation is over 5 times the global average. So everywhere you look on the research, the United States is particularly vulnerable. The US is getting a lot more increase single day extreme rain events. Well, I mean, we're looking at that right now. Coastal floods. There's been an increase in US East coastal floods. And then I'll just finish off by saying, referring back to the program that we did on atmospheric rivers, I think we included the paper that said that California is particularly vulnerable and can expect to get a mega flood sometime in the near future from atmospheric rivers and global warming.
Well, thank you, Peter. That's a pretty stark picture you're painting of my country in particular, the United States. That obviously doesn't mean that there aren't also extremes increasing throughout the planet, as is inevitable. And I just also want to emphasize that notwithstanding that deaths may have declined, property damage has not declined in the first 2 decades of this century versus the last two of the last century. And the other thing I want to just emphasize, and I think it's implicit in a lot of what we say, but I think it's important to specify it, which is we could talk about floods and damage and all the rest of it, but even if deaths have declined and even if damages may or may not be, even though they have increased, we're talking about the human impact, the suffering that occurs when a home is destroyed by flooding and mold is evident and you have to fight with your insurance company and you may lose your job and you might have to find another location to live for 3 months and you can't find the contractor because the contractors that have the ability to clean up after a flood are limited and they often will charge much greater because of supply and demand and on and on and on, that our society, the Holocene world, has not been built for these kinds of disasters. And so the human economic impacts are just unimaginable and, of course, are getting worse and worse. So, with that, as always, I'm happy to introduce Paul Beckwith. Good to see you, Paul. Paul, as everyone knows now, lives in Ottawa. He's taught at universities in the Ottawa area. He hosts a very, very popular YouTube channel with videos on every aspect of the climate crisis. He is a climate system scientist, and I can guarantee that he always has unusual and provocative perspectives on everything we talk about. So, putting that pressure on you, Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter, for your comments, and thank you, Charles and Heidi, for your behind-the-scenes dedication to our work. So, what we're basically seeing is a huge intensification of the water cycle, the hydrological cycle. So, we can start with the temperature of water on the surface of the oceans, the sea surface temperature, on lakes, on rivers, etc. Really much, much warmer waters, of course, leads to much more evaporation from these water bodies. And that water vapor rises up and goes into the atmosphere. And there's a lot more of it going into the atmosphere because warm air can hold about 7% more water vapor for every degree Celsius rise in temperature. Then there's the effects of what happens to that water vapor in the atmosphere. So Peter's mentioned atmospheric rivers can kind of funnel that water into certain regions. I've often talked about the jet streams slowing down and becoming wavier and getting stuck in place. So we're getting a lot more of these meteorological or weather blocking events. We're also getting lots of weather whiplashing, so a region can have a heat dome, drying out the soils and vegetation, making the ground as hard as rock. And then when we get the storms coming in, that water has to run off on the surface because infiltration into the very hard ground is much lower. So that water gets funneled in, and then we have to look at the geography of the region. If you have a region where there's lots of narrow canyons, steep walled river canyons, and so on, the water gets just focused into these channels, and we can see what happened, for example, in Texas. In Texas, the Guadalupe River rose 29 feet in 45 minutes. I mean, how do people get out of the way from that? Actually, it turns out that the organizer of the camp got a warning on his phone an hour before the flooding hit. There's also something called IPAWS, Integrated Public Alert System, whereas everybody with an iPhone can get a flood alert, but that system wasn't activated for this particular region. Also, FEMA actually told this camp, you're on a 100-year floodplain. You can't build any more structures. A number of years ago, they lobbied FEMA to build more structures on the floodplain. FEMA buckled, allowed them to do it. There's a lot of politics. This is a very wealthy, prestigious camp for girls. It's got a very deep history. Many wealthy people send their young girls there. Christian camp, God will protect them, everybody sort of thing. FEMA, by the way, approves 90% of map amendment requests. So it's not just at this camp, but it's other places. So there's all kinds of human reasons why the warnings didn't go out and why people weren't saved. Maybe in the future, in other camps with similar warnings, we'll actually get these systems in place. As Peter has mentioned, the flooding is, and Herb's mentioned, the flooding is globally. It's widespread. You can't argue with the physics and the weather whiplashing from heat waves, heat domes to storms and extreme weather events and back and forth. All of the conditions are working to produce floods that are worse and worse. And we're seeing many 1 in 1,000 year events occurring, within the space of a few weeks. And of course, that completely violates the laws of statistics and physics and so on. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans and the climate system. So this is the reality of today's world that we're going to get a lot more of these events. And we focused on Texas, but Peter's mentioned New York City. There's also been major record rainfalls in North Carolina, in Chicago, Illinois, in New Mexico, up in mountain regions. All of these are causing fatalities. And then in China, Malaysia, Spain, Spain, France, all over the world, we're getting more and more of these types of weather events. So this is what we have to deal with because we've changed the climate system and it's accelerating. Everything is accelerating. I talked about the costs of climate to the US, and that number is about $1 trillion right now. And probably about half of that number is from the flooding events that we're seeing.
Thanks, Paul. You paint quite a comprehensive and occasionally grim picture of what we're experiencing, both at the micro level with particular properties, like all the things that went wrong that didn't need to have gone wrong in Texas, as well as the broader picture. But I think it's important to recognize, and this is in no way meant to minimize the tragedy of what happened in Texas, is that the only time we see something on the news or read about it is if the systems have failed. I mean, for all we know, there have been 500 successful warnings by FEMA or local government officials to evacuate or be aware of potential floods elsewhere, And it's when it doesn't work for, in this case, what appears to be a complex of reasons that we find out about it. And one of the things that has been proposed in the United States, and I don't know whether other countries have this, I would hope that they do, is to have the equivalent of the investigative bodies that are set up to look in the greatest of detail after every plane crash to take a look at what caused it and what actions can be taken to avoid the next one. We're all familiar with, the search for the black box, and the headlines come out, here are the preliminary findings and so forth. And as a result, the airline industry has become safer and safer over the decades because of this institutionalized structure and bureaucracy that's been set up. But there, as far as I know, there's nothing equivalent for, quote unquote, natural disasters like storms and so forth, to be able for a dedicated group of extremely qualified experts to objectively and in a nonpartisan way examine why this happened and what changes are needed to prevent it in the future. And I would hope that the United States and other places that don't have this would think about instituting that as one means of avoiding the kind of unimaginable tragedy that occurred 2 weeks ago in Texas. With that, let me turn it back to Peter.
So, I'm going to say a little bit more about the Grace Twin Satellite project. And I'm going to mention this because this is unique. It's specific to NASA, and it's way better than anything else that the rest of the world has got. I mean, it can do things the rest of the world can't do. And Paul's explained the twin satellite thing very, very well in the past. The NASA Grace, we can go to their data and it'll tell us more reliably than anything else drought and floods. It'll show us where groundwater is increasing. It'll show us where floods are increasing, precipitate, and it'll tell us very, very accurately on drought. I mentioned a paper that was published just a couple of years ago, and there's a good article, of course, by NASA because it's the GRACE project, and it shows that the intensity of floods is increasing at an increasing rate, and it goes up to 2024. So that means it's accelerating, a word that the scientists don't like, but clearly when you look at these graphs, it really is. Now, the other thing to mention is that the science has progressed so far. I mean, our science is absolutely great and it's increasing rapidly. However, we're not doing anything with the science, anything at all. I mentioned one in which there'd been a 20% increase in 15 years of population exposed to floods, and they derived that from the area. And the United States is particularly vulnerable, as I mentioned. India is horribly vulnerable. China is horribly vulnerable. All of Brazil is vulnerable. So that's huge, huge populations that we are talking about. What can we do about it? I'll finish off by saying, well, I thought about this years and years ago. And, I mean, we knew that the amount of rain and atmosphere water vapor was going to increase and increase and increase. So I thought, well, hang on, it's increasing, and yet we're predicting we're going to get worse floods and worse droughts. So really, we just have to move the water around. If we wanted to do that, if the world got together, we could. But the world is not getting together one little bit. It's more interested in war than in the state of the planet and the already catastrophic situation with global heating and climate change. So I feel very, very sad about that. That's for sure.
Well, your point is well taken about what are we going to do about it. I just want to briefly give one example of what one country is doing about it that appears to have at least some success, though it's in its early stages, and that's the critically important country of China. And China has a project called Sponge Cities, where for about the past decade or so, there has been massive urban planning in about 10% of their cities, which is, hundreds as it turns out, to basically, as the name suggests, redesign all of the surfaces in the cities so that they absorb more water, there's less runoff. The city acts as a sponge in the best sense to minimize flooding. This is a very proactive effort, and given the nature of Chinese government and their ability to enforce, shall we say, decisions and actions, it has the potential to make a real difference. Well, I would urge those of you who are watching today, and we'll probably put a link in to that, to take a look at the Chinese model because it's clearly not unique to Chinese cities. In the United States, I know the city I grew up in, Philadelphia, started some years ago a similar project to basically examine almost every surface in the city to see how they can maximize infiltration rather than runoff. I'm, of course, oversimplifying. So there are approaches. They require oftentimes large scale efforts as well as specific technologies, such as you mentioned, Peter and Paul. And we all have to invey and urge and demand our elected officials to take the steps necessary to protect our lives. And with that, back to Paul.
Yes, thank you. So I previously mentioned the different connections between the ocean surface temperatures, water infiltration, jet streams, atmospheric rivers. This is creating more intense rain events, and then the geography channels it. Also, I should mention that we're getting more and more wildfires, and when a wildfire takes out a forest and we get torrential rains on that land, there's a lot more water ending up in the lower points of the land, much less infiltration into the vegetation. You mentioned sponge cities. I mean, parks and things are one of the best things you can do
Hmm.
to absorb water. So wildfires are exacerbating the flooding problem. But the main thing is, what do we do about it? What do humans do about it? And I'll talk about the US in particular. The US has had, until now, what I call a golden shield to protect them against weather events and climate. And that golden shield is the scientists working for the National Weather Service, meteorologists, climate scientists at universities and government institutions, including NASA. What has happened in the last 6 months in these places? I don't think I need to tell you that cuts to humans working in these places has been extremely severe. So we're heading completely backwards in terms of protecting people from these extreme weather events in the US. So it's going to get a lot worse until eventually, insurance companies, other powerful lobby groups will have to convince the government to rehire back people into things like the National Weather Service, meteorology institutions, climate institutions. You can ignore climate change and extreme weather events all you want, but those things are not, unfortunately, going to ignore you. They're not going to ignore your city, your house, your livelihood. They're coming for you. There's places that we're already seeing that just won't get insurance. You can't get insurance on structures, so you can't get mortgages or so on. And I did a whole video on the cost of climate change to the US in particular, and it's approaching $1 trillion a year. Just to put that in perspective, that's more than the US military budget. It's more than the ICE budget. I mean, the money is being redirected to away from areas that protect people from extreme weather events. So to me, this is just like head shaking, closing down a place like just the Goddard Institute of Space Science, cutting back on their funding for climate models, etc. Being anti-science, it's not going to end well. I'd like to ask the US government, getting rid of all of these scientists, how are you ever going to produce any new weapon systems, etc., for the military in the future? You're going back into a scientific dark ages, not just on extreme weather and climate, but on all other aspects of science. So what we're seeing is it's happened before in human history. The world went away from science. Reasons were different. A lot of it was related to the power of the church, etc. But, it just looks like we're heading completely backwards in the way we respond to these events. And, we have technologies where everybody carries a smartphone. We can get warnings on things that are happening, but people are choosing not to do that. And funding is being withdrawn from that exact thing. So that's just the reality of the situation.
Thanks, Paul. It may be, and of course, it's too early to say for sure, that there is some pushback that is appears to be beginning to be effective against some of the forces that you've just eloquently described. For example, this current presidential administration, as most of our viewers may know, had proposed or at least floated the idea of actually eliminating the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is, quite a startling, incomprehensible idea. And the headlines in the last couple of days are suggesting that they are walking back from that as a result of the publicity from the Texas flood. Similarly, a lot of the PR, as you both have addressed, about the shortage in staff at the National Weather Service and how that may have impacted the consequences, are going to make it much more difficult for the administration to continue to cut, cut, and cut, because generally, I think it's fair to say that it's a lot easier to cut when nobody's paying attention. And that's what I think those who are trying to cut science and technology and public information and all those kinds of things are counting on. Ideally, there would be better ways to get public attention than hundreds of people dying, but that's the world that we live in right now. So, as always, I want to thank Peter and Paul for your incisive and thoughtful comments today. This, as always, with all of our topics, is an enormous topic. We can only begin to skim the surface in a half hour or a little bit more. As always, each of these topics is connected in every single way to every other program we've done, because what happens with flooding affects inflation and it affects the economy, as you pointed out, Paul, and everything else. So we can only cover a slice. We hope and trust that the slice we presented to you today you have found beneficial. If so, we would ask that you like this program, that you subscribe to our channel, that you leave us your comments, your suggestions for future programs, that you tell your friends and colleagues and neighbors about the Climate Emergency Forum. We are one of the very few, if only, program on YouTube that focuses just on the climate emergency. And we'll be doing that for a long time to come, it looks like. So, as always, thanks everybody for watching, and we look forward to seeing you, as always, next week.